Exhibitions and collections. I just would like to draw everyone's attention to our exhibition calendar for this semester. There's still a lot of things that are up and happening through the close of the semester, so please pick one of these up at the front desk and check it out, and friend us on Facebook and find out what's going on, and check out our website, which is www.LUAG, Lehigh University Art Galleries.org. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce Anthony Viscardi. For over 20 years, the practice of tracing shadows has informed the architectural investigations and pedagogy of Lehigh University Professor of Art and Architecture, Anthony Viscardi. His drawings and constructions, derived from the direct observation of the passage of light over time, navigate a conceptual landscape between 2- and 3-dimensional space. All right, I thought I lost you. The work in this exhibition began when Viscardi was awarded the 2012 McDowell Colony Fellowship to continue his theoretical drawing and visual investigations of shadow mapping. Viscardi has had solo exhibitions at the Atlanta College of Art, Lehigh University Wilson Gallery. Anybody remember that one? First game. Gallery 164, Buffalo, New York. Nexus Contemporary Art in Atlanta, Philadelphia University of the Arts, Philadelphia 3rd Street Art Gallery, Auburn University, Allentown Art Museum, and the Banana Factory just down the street. Tony is currently the artist in residence at the experimental printmaking workshop at Lafayette College, where he will have a show in fall 2014. And also, we're happy to announce that this exhibition will travel to Fox and Fowl Architects in New York after it is concluded here. So without further ado, please welcome Anthony Viscardi.
Well, first, thank you for coming. It's great to have people look at your work and be able to talk about it. I have, of course, a million people to thank for putting this together. Ricardo, when I first came here in '92, gave me a show in '93 at the Wilson Gallery, and it kind of started my more intense focus into this work. Doing art and architecture, to me, have always gone hand in hand. And it's the kind of thing that's always an individual experience, but always ends up becoming a collaborative episode, you might say. Mark and Jeff were really helpful in the process of putting this together. Brian and Mike Moore helped me a lot, and actually Mike Moore helped me translate my drawings for the laser cutter. So there's a lot of people that I need to thank, including my department and the college, for the support they've given. And Marilyn Jones, who designed this beautiful catalog for me. I have a few of them. If you're interested in them, put your name on a list and I'll try to get one to you. What do I do? Shadows for me have been something that I guess started as a little kid. I was an only child, and I was always amazed that shadows could do many more things than I could. You know, they could get tall and short, they could change their shape when they fell on steps. I could put my shadow in someone else's shadow. So for me, the shadow has always been kind of my sibling in a way. And drawing also, because I had, unfortunately, he just died this week, but my uncle was an illustrator for Superman. And when I was a little boy, he would sit at, I remember one time when I must have had the flu or chickenpox or something, but he sat by the bed and he just started to do this line, taking a walk, kind of the way Paul Klee talks about it. And then it turned into Zorro, and I'm just like, wow, So drawing for me has always been something that kind of allowed me to enter into other worlds, and it was something that became my second means of communicating beyond words. But the shadow thing has always been really strong, a strong influence in my work. And when I was in my 20s, I had an architectural practice in Atlanta, and this started as a design-build practice. So a partner and I would make models and go build stuff. But at that period, this was in '76, when the first big economic crunch occurred, and all of a sudden gasoline got real expensive, so people got interested in solar energy and sustainable design. So at that point, I kind of started to re-educate myself, because when I was in school, we talked a little bit about sustainability, but not much. So I started to think about the sun as something that became an integral member of my design palette when I'm designing a building or a house. And not so much just to keep the cost of the heat down or things like that, but also to animate the space. I remember one project I had where the kitchen, it was a renovation, the kitchen was in a bad location, and you couldn't really see the seasonal changes. So I remember telling the client I'd like to plant a deciduous tree out there because it would change leaves and would color, and at least you'd have somewhere to see how the world is changing around you, how a house in particular should not be something that closes you in, but opens you up to a cosmological or seasonal experience. So the sun, and then I also remember as a young architect always being amazed, particularly being in the Northeast where you have deciduous trees. It was always amazing for me to see a tree in the winter. The shadow would almost cut the building up because the shadow would move, and it almost looked like it literally cut into the building. And then when I started to study history of architecture, I realized when stuff was made in masonry, how they would literally make all the profiling in the masonry to cast shadows to lighten the feeling of the material. So in a way, shadows can dematerialize things. But in architecture, it's kind of interesting because my work comes from an architectural basis. I was trained as an architect. I was trained to use rapidographs, which are pens that have ink in them with different sizes. I was trained to draft and all these things, use pencil and different papers. Now we're in a realm where the computer does that stuff. So the computer uses digital technology to make drawings, to make buildings to be built. And in a way, it's actually liberated drawing. For me, drawing now has become something, all those techniques, that I can kind of fall away from the practical constraints of architecture and allow drawing to enter into a space of imagination. And so, I've been doing this work. When I was a practicing architect in Atlanta, I was also part of an artist collective. So back, I think in 1975, I may have done my first shadow paper sculpture, and it just kept moving a light around it and watching the shadow move. And so I always became somewhat fascinated with it. But like I said, in terms of the drawing techniques, I'm using the things that used to be the way to communicate to people to go from a two-dimensional drawing to a three-dimensional object. In a way, what I'm doing is the opposite. I make three-dimensional objects, and while I'm making those three-dimensional objects, I'm drawing the shadow. And then when I take the object away, I use that shadow to generate new three-dimensional objects. So in a way, I've kind of still in the genre of architectural practice, but I'm taking what would normally be called a plan, which I call a shadow, and using it to make a building, like a section. And I first started using this as a teacher at Georgia Tech back in, 85 or 86, where I asked the students to make a light projecting wall based on their site, and then from that light projecting wall, we would use that, again, to generate architecture. The way I do this, again, because when I was a practicing architect, you always think about the four seasons, the four cardinal directions, the different times of the day, morning, evening, night. You're always thinking of cycles. And in architecture, for me, design has always been an iterative process. You start one thing, then you do it over, and then you do it over, and it transforms. And that's some of the beauty of architectural, or you might say the creative design process, because you're constantly transforming one thing into the other. For me, when I started this thing, and when I did it at Georgia Tech, I told the students to go out in the morning, the afternoon, and the evening, so that they can have these shadows projected on their plan, on their paper, because at that time it was actually on their site plan. And then they ended up using it to generate space. And what I noticed, it was amazing, because sometimes design can become very self-conscious. You tend to make things that are either reproductions of what you've seen or blah, blah, blah. When you have something like this shadow map, it becomes like an unself-conscious ally that you use in the process as you're adding more criteria to it. So the process I go through when I do this, I start by going out 3 times a day, like I tell the students, and I collect things. I collect leftover pieces of models after studios, interesting blocks that I find. you know, when you teach in a studio where people make things, there's tons of leftover stuff. Okay, so I just put all this leftover stuff into a bag, a big plastic bag. I just cram it in there. I don't care if it breaks. And then when I go out to shadow cast, I play, and play has always been a really important part for me of the design process. Something I learned from my son when I was about 2 years old, because when he would play, there was no purpose in it. He was just playing, you know. It was just in this euphoric state of playing with stuff and seeing things. And I think all of us need that. And I think when you give yourself that freedom to play in the creative design process, it really unleashes a lot of stuff. So I have this bag of stuff that I take out. I set up a board, a fairly big board, and I put a piece of paper down, and usually I set up an east-west line on it and a north-south line. And then I just start to hold objects, and what I'm doing is when I'm making the objects, I'm looking at the shadow, and every 5 or 10 minutes I'm tracing the shadow. You know, so I make these constructions, and so what it means is the object that generates the shadow is now like the shadow because it's provisional. It only occurs for a short while, you know. What's interesting about shadows too is they're referential. You know, if you're looking down and you see a shadow on the ground, you look up and you see a plane. You know, so the shadow is always referring to his object, but it doesn't always take the shape of his object because it falls over things. And this project, this piece here, if you guys move out of the way for a second, was a little bit of my homage or practice of that notion. Because what I did when I was at McDowell, I thought, well, you know, I'm always talking about the shadow comes from the object, but it belongs to the surface. So I ended up making these 3 plaster casts just by crinkling tin foil and putting plaster on it. And then I, again, with my leftover pieces, because I made this horizontally, so it was sitting on the table. And as I was making the wooden part, I was tracing the shadow. And I did it 3 times a day. And then I took a Dremel, which is a little drill we use, and I carved out the shadow into the existing topography. So for me, I call it a sundial because it is the graphic sundial. I mean, I think in the future, I may like to actually now take some polymers and actually pour them into the space and make the reverse, because shadows are cast. And I like the idea of casting shadows, and literally casting them into the ground. And so this piece was kind of, I mean, it's not part of the drawing sequence, but it is part of, you might say, the conceptual notion of this. When I first started this drawing series, I actually made a bibliography of shadows. And what I did is I first took pictures of my hand moving, and then I just traced the shadows. So I had this line of just shadows of my hand. Then as I was using the compass, I was using the compass outside, and while I was drawing with the compass, I was tracing the shadows, so it showed my hand as an instrument. Because I'm a big believer in hands, and how your hand teaches your eye, not always the other way around. So when you're making things with a model, or if you're drawing in particular, drawing, there's a resistance you have from the pencil on the paper, and what's happening with your eye, and all this other stuff. Same thing in making models, that I think doesn't occur on a computer screen. Other things occur in the computer screen, but that kind of tactile experience has always been something that I've found comfort in. And so when I'm doing this exercise and tracing these squiggly shadows, and even more fun when I'm watching my students do it, because they're out on the grass doing this weird stuff and not really sure what it's going to be, but they're all having fun and they're tracing these things, and then they have to throw away the model. The model is so poorly made that it falls apart on its own, but it doesn't matter because this beautiful shadow map's there. And so the shadow map is just another layer, in architectural speaking. The shadow map becomes a layer that you would put on top of your site analysis or your Noli plans. It's just another layer. And when they do it, it's really fun to watch them because they have to give up a little bit of control and allow the shadow to lead them. And it actually it always produces pretty strong form. Whether they can make it into good architecture, that's a different story, but it definitely produces strong form. So when I do this thing, I've always felt like there's actually a long history of the shadow in architecture, in the fact that the Romans used to literally crush someone in the foundation of their building so that their spirit would be so pissed off that it would protect the spirit of the building. When they got a little more civilized, what they would end up doing is the mason would watch the site, and if a particular person walked through the site when the shadow was really long, he would measure the site with a string or rope and then bury that string in the box in the foundation, and supposedly you stole the spirit of the person, and that person would die, but the spirit's within the building. So there's always been this thing about, and De Chirico, many artists have used the shadow to either foretell the future or forecast doom or all these, because it's a very interesting thing, because all of us, everything has this other. You know, as long as we exist in this cosmological environment, we have this other, you know. And this other is a funny thing. You know, it gets, like I said, it gets long, short, takes different shapes. And in architecture, it tells you about the time of the day, but more importantly, the acts and activities that occur. If you have a cat, you'll see that they follow where the sun is, you know. In Mesa Verde, you see these incredibly beautiful cliff dwellings that the day was organized on in terms of how the sun moved through. And even our great Frank Lloyd Wright made this really simple building once. It was a half a circle, and basically the back part of the wall was this 3-foot thick stacked stone wall. But what's the part called that goes like this? The diameter, there you go. Really good in math. That diameter was the thin piece of glass, and the mullions would actually move, and the mullions actually determined where you ate, where you lived. So our acts and activities used to be more in tune with the movement of the sun. With electricity, we get into a whole different realm. So for me, it's always been this dynamic element. So anyway, going back to the history of it, I feel like when I'm tracing the shadows of these objects, I'm stealing them. I feel a little bad, actually, because I'm making these objects and I'm tracing the shadow, and then I throw away the object. I kept this one because I knew the show was coming, but usually I take the thing apart, cram it into the bag again, pull it out again later. But in order for me to feel like I've done the labor to deserve the shadow, I make these ink drawings. So you'll see one behind that tall gentleman. You see two other large ones there. And these I call primitives. The reason I call them primitives is they are the actual full-scale shadow drawings. So as I'm putting these blocks around and making, you know, sticks and everything, I'm tracing this stuff with a very wiggly line. And then I go back with my rapidograph and my ink brush and I ink them. And it takes a long time. You know, people look at the drawings and they think the drawings are labor intensive. The ink is labor intensive. But for me, if I do the labor, I now own the shadow. So I can now sever the contract between the object and the shadow because I just worked 20 hours to draw it, you know. And it's now a new object. It's not just giving one shadow, which represents one moment in that object. It's giving a multitude of shadows which represent that particular object in a time and a space continuum. So, you know, in my catalog, I have a wonderful essay that one of my ex-students wrote, Danielle Rago, that says this pretty nicely. But it's that idea of, you know, objects have multitude of shadows. When I create these palimpsests and I ink them, I codify it to become mine. So that's the first stage. I first do these things. I have these big drawings. Again, when I did the large drawings, McDowell had a really beautiful big table, incredibly beautiful studio, in a month to do nothing but art. It's like the gift from heaven, you know. You can just work, they even feed you. I mean, they do everything, you know. So it was a wonderful experience for me, first of all, to have someone have the confidence in my work to say, you can do this. And then it's really kind of jump-started my more serious attention to being an artist. I always used to think I was an architect who did art, but I'm an artist. I do things that defer or move away from the realm of architecture, but it's deeply embedded in it. So let's move down here a little bit. So now you can see the other primitives that I'm sorry. And it's kind of funny because, you know, primitive is also a term that Greg Lynn used in his early work in the computer. And even though my work's by hand, it actually is in the same realm of what's going on in contemporary architectural discourse right now. Because rather than injecting formulas, the things from the outside to generate a design, I'm using light and I'm using my hand. So in a way, even though it's a manual, sensual thing, it's very much the same as trying to get an outside influence to generate form. What you're seeing here is a shadow map that's a pencil on mylar, and it's the shadow of that object. That object, and the way I do this is I don't make the full object and then draw the shadow. As I'm making the object, I'm drawing the shadow. So I put a few pieces up, I trace. I put a few more pieces up, I trace. I do that morning, afternoon, evening, and on this one I actually did, no, this one was done on 3 pieces of paper because I didn't have something long enough. And then, rather than inking it, I put a long piece of mylar on it. Now, I started these mylar drawings probably in 2002, 2003. And what I discovered was really great. And it was one of those things that only comes out of the manuality of drawing. Because when I was trained to draw as an architect, if you were doing an ink drawing or a pencil drawing and you're right-handed, you would start on the left and go right because you don't want to smear it. Now what I started to do is start on the right and go left, so that while I was drawing, my hand was naturally smearing the lead, because mylar isn't really made for lead, it's made for ink. But it's actually really good on lead because it smears. And so it's getting not only the trace of the line, but the trace of my hand. And that smearing, and you can tell when you're looking at it, if there's an area that has more drawing, it's usually darker because it's smearing more, you know. And when I've had the students do this, sometimes they try to just get some lead dust out of their thing and smear it on. It's just not the same. You can't add it. You know, you can't add it. That's to be part of the process. And the other thing is the computer can't do it. So finally I found one thing: the computer can't smear it. You can have it put a screen over it, but it's not going to be in that smear like my hand. So I feel like, yeah, that's good. I like that. And again, I'm not a Luddite, I love the computer, but the thing is, there are certain things that come from your body that I don't want to lose. I don't know if it's because I'm Italian, or I like my body, I like people's bodies, I like the sensuality of what it feels like to make things with my body. I think I learned from watching my hands do things. I was amazed when my son was born, and I realized he didn't know his hand was connected to his body. He would just see it go past his face now and then. Really great stuff. You know, it's something that to me is a pretty amazing instrument. So when I'm doing this one, and I did an exhibit in Buffalo in 2006 or 7, I remember, where I had about 10 of these very large drawings that were 4 foot by 8 foot. And what I did is I would use the primitives in their full scale to make my collages, because these are collages, and I'll talk about those in a second. So, but anyway, you get to see here, when you're drawing, you can quickly make something 2-dimensional look 3-dimensional by giving it thickness. Okay? So the minute I have a double line here, the drawing lifts off the page. And also, the minute I have dark area that I can erase, the drawing comes off the page. So it really becomes like a palimpsest. Now, 2 of the architects I study a lot, one in particular, Carlos Scarpa, had this technique of drawing because he would spend 20 years to make one building. So that, if we had 20 weeks now, we're lucky. But when he would do these drawings, he would actually do a drawing on Fabriano, beautiful watercolor paper. And then he would do these tracings over it, and he'd have, every day he'd work on these tracings, he'd have a blueprint, he'd work again. So when I was studying this back in back in the 80s, I guess, I love this notion of palimpsest. And he had a comment once where he said, for him, drawing's like carving a marble, because when you draw on Fabriano, if you make a line and then erase it, later on when your hand's moving, that line comes back because it's a dent in the paper. So as you're drawing, all these things are revealing themselves. So I always was amazed about that. I like having a record of my activity, just the way these shadow maps are a record of a day in the life of that object as I trace it. I like when I make things that leave a trace, that leave something that was unintended that I can then play with. And whenever that happens, it allows the serendipity of improvisation to occur. When something happens you don't expect, then you have to react to that And once you get into that reactive mode, you're liberated. You're no longer thinking, well, I have this image in my mind, and if I could just learn how to draw it. It's always funny when I had one student once at Georgia Tech tell me, well, I really know exactly what I want to do. You just need to teach me how to draw it. That's okay. You know, but and what I realized back then, you know, I realized now too, is when you draw or make a model or anything, it just pulls out a little bit of what you're thinking in your mind. I, of course, have a lot of students that say, I just can't make this model because it's never going to be as perfect as my image. And that's all malarkey to me, to use our vice president term, because when you pull something out, you have something to react to. And that's what I have here. When I pull something out, I have something to react to. It allows my imagination to enter into this imaginary space. So that's the relationship between these two objects. And it was a great, great thing when Mark and Jeff said, let's do this Batman signal and have a shadow go up on the wall. And it was just really great to think about that now having, and people have even said, well, I like the shadow way more than the object. That's even better, you know, because again, you know, and you know, we talked about rotating, it got a little too crazy. But, and I think, you know, and again, working with Mark and Jeff on this, because Ricardo was in the hospital during that period, it was really fun, because we were collaborating. It's always fun to have people that are working with you to get their creative misunderstanding sometimes of what you're doing, which actually takes you to the next level. So once I have this thing, so I either have this primitive in pencil or Milo or the primitive in ink, I can do what I want with it. I own it. So when I first got the fellowship, and I was on sabbatical, and I got the fellowship, before I got the fellowship actually, I had to work in a really small area, and so I had a small table. And so what I started to do is photograph these things and reduce them. So when I reduced them and worked on a light box, I could just start playing with the tracing and move it around. And this is something I do with my students also, but they do it more formally with the notion of turning something that's idiosyncratic into something systemic by multiplying. If you multiply anything, it forms a system, you know. But in this thing, it wasn't like multiplying the same thing. As I'm moving it around, it generates new form. So let's look over here. So when I was working on the small mylar, because I also believe in the geometry of my body. I have this geometry, my wrist, I have this geometry, and I have this geometry. So when I'm working small, drawing again really interacts with your body. And so when I was drawing small, my hand was only moving like this. And I would, you know, when I was doing these drawings, what I'm doing here now is taking one primitive, reducing it, and allowing myself to enter into this realm of imagination where I can now collage the object any way I want to. And when I'm drawing it and moving it around, I don't have this image in mind. I usually just move, as I'm tracing, the image starts to tell me what it wants to be. And of course, I'm trained in architecture and art, I know composition, all that stuff. I don't think that stuff, but it's just in there. You know, when you start drawing, there's things that deal with symmetry or lack of symmetry or high or low. But when I'm doing these things, you know, like anything, you know, when people talk about style in art or architecture, for me it's just a matter of developing a visual vocabulary, and that visual vocabulary then gets permeated in your work. It's not like I'm neoclassical or I'm, you know, modernist. I mean, all that stuff's fine, and people tend to backtell that story. But for me, the style comes out of the nature of my hand and the nature of the thing that I'm drawing. So even though these are being tracings, these are tracings of little pieces, as I'm drawing them, because I'll draw them over a long period, sometimes long, sometimes I'll sit down for maybe 3 or 4 hours and I can do one drawing. And then I go back and erase, because usually when I'm drawing, I draw it all, and then I go back and erase, so I'm subtracting out. So these little drawings really started to fascinate me because they had an amazing amount of detail, and people had to get this close to it. So when you get this close to it, your periphery vision starts to come into play, and your eye starts moving around. And the funny thing that I noticed about doing these drawings is the smaller the drawing became and more intricate, the more it started to look like large imaginary cityscapes. You know, so it's kind of funny. And so I have, you know, a lot of these things that when I'm drawing them, again, I'm not thinking of architecture, but it's in me. You know, I'm over 60, so I have a lot of years of ingrains of stuff. So as I'm drawing, you know, this one's, you know, and again, in terms of names, I come out at the very end. This one's called terminal precincts because it tends to move around and feel like it, you know, there's this clear neck of a structure that's moving around. In this one, I call it air crafting or crafting air because it felt light. I didn't think to make it that way, but in the end, it felt light and it feels like there's bridges and everything. So what it does is it allows you as the viewer to enter into my imaginary space. And it's funny, sometimes the things that get small, more intimate, they become more immense. And there's a great term, a chapter of The Poetics of Space by Bachelard called intimate immensity. And I just love that term, because it seems like the more you get into it, the bigger it becomes. And the funny thing is, I had one drawing that we were going to do in here was really big, but unfortunately it was 9 foot rather than 8 foot, so we can put it in. But that one, I took the drawing over there and blew it up. So when I was McDowell, I put it on the projector, blew it up. And when I was drawing it, it was blurry, so I had to kind of use my imagination to fill it in. But I used a piece of graphite stick, like it wasn't a pencil. So the line was thicker. And as the line got thicker and the object got bigger, it was more, it seemed to be perceived more so like an object, or even like the primitives. You look at the two primitives, they look more anthropomorphic, like your body. And then when you go to the small drawings, they look more urban, which is kind of an interesting thing in art, the way you perceive lines on paper, and how those lines can either make things seem really big, even though the drawing is small, or seem really small. Because the one drawing that I did, we don't have in here, when I put it up vertically, it actually looked like an object, like a vase or something. So it was those kind of discoveries for me are what turn me on. I like when I'm doing my work that I discover things. I think when you discover things in this play field, it makes you have a peak experience and it makes living be more fun. So it makes the more mundane crap, you got to do a lot more fun when you have these experiences of, wow, I feel like I've seen something today I hadn't seen before. And if I do anything for my students, I try to get them to see things, and drawing is the way to go. But anyway, so these drawings, I have these two and those three over there that are kind of, when you look at them later on, you want to look close at them because they start to really pull you into the drawing. Let's go over here now. And lucky, those of you that are my age, when I walked in the shadow and I stood like this, I felt like Alfred Hitchcock. So what you're seeing now is some jumps. Behind Mark is one of the larger drawings. It's called Urban Mimic. But again, this is the show I usually do. The shows I've done are usually large drawings. This is the first time I've shown the small drawings. But at a certain point, one of my initial questions that I asked while I was doing this from the very beginning was really pretty basic. If an object can cast a shadow, can a shadow cast an object? And so, and again, I used to maybe play around with, whenever you have a straight building, it creates a diagonal shadow. If you took that shadow and actually pulled it up and said, that's my facade, it got really interesting. So, and that's what I do with the students. But I wanted to enter into this realm of digital craft because I really believe that there's certain things that the computer and digital machines can do that I just can't do. I can create the drawings and all these other things, but it seemed like the digital craft might send me in a new direction. And I was excited. So I hired Mike Moore, an ex-student of mine, and we worked together to translate just a few of my drawings so the computer can cut them. And actually, I took the first 2 drawings that I did for that 1993 exhibit, and one of them in particular is the one that generated the Flexibilities cube and this piece around the corner. And it was really kind of interesting because, in art, nothing is ever done. You're constantly recycling things. Like I said before, art to me is an iterative process. It just continues, one thing gets transformed into the next thing, into the next thing, into the next thing. So when Mike finally got the drawings together, because actually before I went to McDowell, I had Nick Nikoloff actually help me do a quick one, and I cut something out of chipboard and I brought it with me. I had no idea what I was going to do with it. I just had, when I went to McDowell, I had everything I could possibly think of bring with me because someone was giving me a month to play. So my element was filled to the gills with wax, plaster, I had everything, and everything that I could possibly think I would need. So when I was there, and I took this thing out, this thing laser cut, and it was all kind of lacy and falling apart. And what I started to do is I started to take, some of the pieces would fall out. And so I would take that piece and turn it vertical and then just pull the piece up and it would hold it off the ground. And then I started to realize, well, if I do that enough, it actually starts to create these different shadows. So I made this little cardboard thing. Didn't think much of it, but I had it there, but I knew it kept drawing me to the whole thing. When I came back, what you'll see back here later, you'll see the wood, I translated that thing I had in cardboard into wood. And it was really important for me to talk about opaque shadows, because like I was saying earlier, one of the things that was most intriguing to me when I started to study architecture was how trees and things cast shadows on buildings, and really the shadow is almost like a knife. It's literally cutting into the surface. So when I did this piece, I was thinking about how do I take opaque layers and allow the shadows to be projected on each one of those layers the way those shadows used to be in my mind when I saw them on buildings. So I got some wood and I did the laser cut again. And again, whenever I do something in a new medium, I'm looking for that media noise. You know, what is intrinsic to that media? I remember back in the day when all we had was faxes, I did some collaborations with artists where we would send drawings to each other through fax, and it was so muddled when it got to the next person, it was actually kind of good because they had to interpret it. So you're always looking for that. The laser cutter burns the edge, and I remember when my students first did this with the models, I got really mad. It's like, sand that off, you know, and now I love that burn, because what it does is it actually makes the edge of the wood dark. And when you look at this piece back here, it's like the dark line you put on a drawing. So it was really, again, a nice byproduct. But this one dealt more, it's almost like, right now at the Printmaking Institute, I'm dealing with embossing and embossing some layers of paper and cutting through it the way I'm doing here. But paper is a whole different medium, and embossing is a whole different medium too. So I'm always dealing with that idea. But anyway, so I created this piece back here that dealt with this notion of opaque shadows in a way that you can trap the shadows deeper into the building. And then I said, okay, let's go to plexiglass. You know, so let's look here. And this was quite a discovery, and it generated so many ideas in my mind now that it's kind of exciting. But when Mike came, you know, he showed me the stuff he did out of wood, and then he said, you know, I can actually etch into the plexiglass too. So rather than cutting it out, we can etch different layers. So I said, okay, take this thing and give me a couple examples of how, you know, different depths so I can see what the etching's like. And let's just make it a square, you know. And so he came back with these things, and they were, and the first model I made was half that size, out of 1/8" plexiglass. And again, when I did that other model, I learned this technique by, you know, the back piece is etched, the front piece is cut out. And so if you can see here that each one of these pieces comes from the cutout. So on this one, I just took the cutout and turned it perpendicular, glued it to that wall, and glued it to this, and it allowed the piece to stand up. So just by rotating the piece 90 degrees within the place that it has, it immediately gave me support for the next layer. And again, this was all a journey and exploration. I had no idea. So I made a couple of these things. And, you know, and architects were into cubes, you know, so I made a couple of these, then I started to stand them up. I actually just put two together in a corner, and I was just blown away. I mean, because not only was it shadow, the thing that generated this as a shadow is now casting light, you know, because you see it all over. And the thicker this gets, because when I went to 1/4 inch, this becomes more like a prism. So when the light's coming through here, it's casting light everywhere. So I got really excited. The fact that it went full circle to actually stealing the shadow from light and now giving it back to light in the terms of this plexiglass piece. And again, the thing about this piece, in my studio, around 3 o'clock, the sun comes really deep into the space. And so it would just explode with light. When the light hits this thing at an angle, it really is amazing. It just gets incredibly bright. And I started taking pictures. You need to look inside of here, because then I started to become the architect again. I said, well, what if I was this big? You know, and you know, I know something about artists. I'm getting better at it, but I know Lucas Samaras made these mirror boxes that made space go on infinitely, and so I started thinking about that. But then you know, when I made the first piece, it was a small cube, and I screwed up one of these pieces, so I had a leftover. So I laid it down and put the little cube on top of it. And then I started to think about, you know, for me, architecture the true art of architecture is having a group of people come together to do it. Because when you make something as a group, it builds a certain sense of community because actions go beyond words. You have to rely on each other to hold something, so on and so forth. So part of me said, I want to get to the point where I can actually bring this art back into the public sector. And now what I'm hoping, I was going to do something at the Corning Company. They have a fellowship, but they're more involved in their residency with small pieces of cast glass. But what I would really like to do here, and if I can get the Graham Foundation grant or whatever, I get lots of money, I would love to build this full scale, but also have water come through here and go down the face of it, because then when it would hit these panels, it would splash. And then the water, if the water's on the ground, and like I said, I had a piece that was this big, the water would circulate under the plexiglass, kind of the way, I always was amazed when I went to school in Virginia, and when I went to the mountains of Virginia in the winter, when you would see the water under the ice and the cascades, it just would blow my mind. And even when I walk around, I live across from the cemetery, and whenever it's after an ice storm, you can look at a tree and you can see the water behind, like capillary, behind the ice. It's incredible, you know. So I said, wow, wouldn't this be great if actually the water's pumped up, splashes here, circulates there, different times of the day, the angle of the sun, just the way I did it when I started the drawing. It's spraying, creating a rainbow. And it brings me full circle back to being what we call a critical architecture. Architecture that's talking about architecture not just to make functional buildings, but to use architecture to illuminate the things we tend to ignore, light, shadow. I mean, I tell my students a lot of times that we as artists and architects are trying to make the invisible visible. Because most of the time people don't see it. Most of the time people walk looking at their iPhone or they're into another zone. And when I do this with my students, and the thing they have to do in the beginning of this project is just go out and take pictures of shadows, but they can't show me the object. They have to just show the shadow. And immediately they say, God, I see shadows everywhere. But you have to kind of turn that station on. If you don't, it's kind of like when my wife was pregnant, I saw everybody was pregnant, you know. So whenever you tune a certain thing in, you see it. And they all of a sudden were coming around. And I do this when I take them to Italy too. They have to take pictures of things that represent earth, fire. And they're walking around taking pictures of weird things. And then other people see them taking pictures of weird things and they start to see it. And so it's like, wow, that's great, you know, because half of the time we're all sleepwalking. And you know, I feel like I have the best job in the world. I'm so privileged to be a professor of art and architecture where I'm paid to take people out to the extreme, to have the imagination go to the limit. I mean, it's great. And so now what I'm hoping comes next, because what I'm doing right now in the printmaking, only thing I did maybe about 20 years ago was some monoprints, which I loved. And that was with leftover pieces too. So now I'm working with Curly Holton and Jace Clark over at our enemy, Lafayette, and they have this great, you know, experimental printmaking institute. And I'm learning a lot, you know, because again, now I'm not there just to reproduce my drawings, because when I went there and I showed Curly, it's just, you don't want to reproduce that, that's what it is. Let's take it to the next level. I mean, let's see what printmaking does. Same thing when great photographers, you know, great photographers take pictures, but they're actually taking a picture of themselves onto what they see. It's like the camera becomes a projection of you, and then that medium changes. So right now I'm having a lot of fun in printmaking. I'm trying several different things at once. And like I said, for me, I've been doing this for a long time. Probably since about 1987, I've been doing it with students, and right now I have a group of students that are doing this shadow casting thing. Some of them from the other studios are here. And it's just something that maybe, you know, sometimes students will ask me, well, am I going to use this in the firm? So, well, no one's going to tell you to go out and trace shadows. But you're going to have a project, and what you do in 10 weeks, you got to do in about 2 hours. Okay? But it's planted in your psyche now. Right now, I've at least been able to infect you with some bit of an idea that will make you see things that you probably will be able to do this in 10 minutes or 15 minutes. Because you won't ignore that anymore. And also when I have people come here that are not in art, architecture, or anything, they just sink into the realm of drawing, because drawing is an amazing thing that you learn as a little kid when you're scribbling. You know, when you scribble, it's just purely motor control. But then all of a sudden it becomes a circle and an eyes and a nose and it's mom. So all of a sudden scribbling becomes figure. And then it goes on from there. You know, and my greatest influences when I started to teach, and even before I was teaching as a student, I didn't realize it, were the Bauhaus, you know, Kandinsky, Klee, Malinage, all these people that during that period were playing. They're basically playing with these great, great things and trying to codify it in some form of art. And when I think about point a line to plane, or I think about Paul Klee talking about a line taking a walk, that's what these drawings are. They're a line taking a walk in my imagination as I transform shadows into objects. Thanks. Yes.
I noticed that a lot of the artwork here is like blacks and whites. And have you ever experimented with casting? Experiment with like use of different colored lights?
Yeah, architects are some. I guess we're notorious for being afraid of color. I've been in black and white, as you can see, but actually, yes, I have tried with color, and now in the print studio, I'm trying to jump out there. I'm doing a lot of silk screens. And I'm trying to deal with the vibration of color, so if you do like a green with a red, it really vibrates. But it's interesting you mention that, because like I was saying, I'm trying some stuff now with embossed paper that I'm cutting some of it out, and you're seeing one layer embossing on another. And actually my wife came by last night and said, oh, it'd be nice to see color on there. And I wouldn't want to color it, but I think if I shot light through it, colored light through it, because you do get color, shadows can be colored.
That's one thing I noticed about that. I noticed about shadows, there's different like textures or hues to the shadows depending on what layers of the glass, the layers
And the distance to the light. Because when I do my drawings, these shadow drawings, I always do them outside because the sun is so far away and so powerful. You get an incredibly distinct line. When you do this, you can see this is blurrier than that. But I'm trying to jump into color. You might even see me stop wearing black soon, just get a little bit better about color.
But actually, traditional Chinese gray is color. So you can have different layers of gray between black and white, and actually can bring the three dimensions. In the traditional way, they don't using other colors to represent color. So maybe gray is another way.
Well, that's great, because that also makes me think of, there's this great little book, I don't know if any of you have ever read it, by Tanasaki, called Praise of Shadows, a little tiny book. And he talks about how the Japanese see shadows in their houses, and it's so incredibly beautiful, because they talk about layers of gray. And it's just so amazing to see these layers of gray that aren't shadows to me, they're more shades. It's the shade of things, so that's great. Do you have a question? Anybody else? Students, what do you think? She did this project.
She did do this project. It's nice to see your work in a space instead of in your office.
That's true.
It really brings it to life in all the details that you put into it.
I think it's always fun for me to watch students do this exercise, because to be able to share, and that's again, my focus is on the creative design process. And when I have 13 or 15 students doing it, it's just amazing. And initially, it's really hard to get them to play because it's been beat out of them in high school. You don't play, that's not serious stuff. But then you realize as an artist or as anybody in creativity, whether you're working for IBM or Google, play is what makes ideas happen. You have to have that space of purposeless activity. It's ingrained in our body. We watch kittens and seals and they always are playing. And I think when I finally see my students release, and especially her, because she was pretty tight, once she finally released, the stuff she made was amazing. But initially it was like, can I really do this? They'll say, can I really do this? And yeah, it's part of it. Everything in architecture has to eventually be functional. But function is just one level of it. I didn't marry my wife because she was functional. I married her because she enhanced the way I see the world. Architecture has to enhance the way you see the world. It has to perform. It's not just a place where the kitchen work triangle works real great. That's always good, but it's more than that. And I think for me, that's been in my blood for a long, long time. And when I see my students' light bulb go off, it's the greatest reward. Because in the beginning, they go, why am I doing? Even Mike Moore, when I had him initially, he came to me, I said, I don't know, I just can't get into this thing. It just seems too arbitrary or something. And then once he went through it, he learned. Because again, I can explain it scientifically. I can talk about azimuth and altitude and certain things that we talk about in terms of sustainability. But that's like looking at the sun as something you calculate. And when you do this stuff, they actually have to go outside and sweat. And then when they go into the shade of a tree to cool off for a while. So now, not only are they tracing the shadow, they know what it means. And when I take them to Italy, it's kind of fun in Italy because they have a phrase, imprende dell'umbra, means let's go take a shadow, which means let's go in the arcade and have a glass of wine. So it's kind of a thing that's this wonderful kind of thing that the shadow has been part of. So I feel very privileged that the shadows let me take it on as a buddy in what I'm doing right now. Any other thoughts? Yes.
So when you were talking before about how if you make many of an object, it becomes a series. A system, excuse me, a system. It made me think in music of theme and variations.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just wondering if, it becomes a system as each one develops differently than the next one.
Absolutely, and like music, because I'll use that as a reference a lot of time. In music, you have rhythm, but rhythm in art and architecture is structure and proportion, right? So you can have a bass beat, boom, 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 and then the rhythm, the proportion, bum, 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 changes. And as the thing repeats and becomes more stable, you introduce more elements that throw it off. So it's very much like it. When I remember reading about Stravinsky and Shostakovich, is that right? Who was it? Shostakovich that did the collaboration with Stravinsky? I can't. No, not. I'm thinking about Kandinsky and it was an artist and a musician, and they did. And I know it was Kandinsky, but I'm thinking maybe it was Shostakovich, but maybe not. But this idea, because there's also this famous phrase that architecture is frozen music. I don't think it is. I think it's dynamic. Architecture is not the material we're in, it's the activity in it. And the sun is the same thing. The sun makes every building a passive machine. So as the sun's moving, the space is warping. If you let it in. A lot of times people don't let it in. Again, I think people who grew up in the 20s, the sun, and before automation and air conditioning, you had porches, you had brise-soleils, all this stuff that even in Italy now they're finally getting air conditioning, and they hate screens, so you have to open the door. But there's something about that rhythm that I think is part of drawing, it's part of architecture. The thing about this notion of something idiosyncratic becoming systemic is real intriguing to me, and again, it even goes back when you look at M.C. Escher's work. He was an artist, but also an incredible mathematician. So he would take this thing, and once the grid got stable, he would ripple the grid. And it's funny, because when I see students do that, it's almost like it's the idiosyncratic thing is somewhat subjective. You're deciding what it wants to become. The systemic thing is objective. You just multiply, and all of a sudden it becomes something. So, I had some students at Lafayette that they do that with shadows, but I've had my students here do it with fingerprints, because there's an inherent thing. And it's kind of interesting when you see that. And for me, when I do my drawings, like the drawing behind there, which that's a drawing of that primitive. So you can see, when I was just repeating that thing, things start to overlap. And then I had 4 of them that were overlapped. And because I had 4 of them, they were smearing a lot. And then I made one on the other side with no smear. And then it made me think of calling it the Bachelors, because I felt like there were these 4 suitors with this one perfect image. But that has all kinds of embedded stuff that I don't want to get into. But there's something about the idea of repeating something. And when you repeat it, it can either give you something new, but it can become stabilized. And then you have to infect it with something else to jump it to the next level. And it's exciting. It's a part of what we do in architecture, because when we make big buildings, we usually have to come up with cells and all this other stuff. But it's an interesting point. I think music and architecture and film are really closely related. Because film is light and space on cellulose or on some recorded thing. Music is instantaneous. You only hear it when you hear it, and your memory keeps it. And with me, that's the way it is with the drawings. The shadow moves, so I only have a memory of what the shadow was 10 minutes ago. And when I trace it, I can then use it. So once the object is gone, that's what makes me get into these drawings, because now my memory is informing my imagination. I used to have a lot of these discussions with my students that if your memory is too strong, it inhibits your imagination, because if all you think you can do is what you've seen, then you don't open up the box, you know. Where sometimes when memory and imagination dance together, then they really create wonderful stuff, because you can't erase your memory. You know, and the Bauhaus was famous that period of saying history started when you were born, which is good in a way, you know. But I realize that memory and imagination now really collude to form very interesting perceptions. And Bachelard's always one of my favorite philosophers because he talks about a daydream as being a recollective memory in the present. It's just beautiful layers of stuff. But I'm not answering your question, I'm just going off on a reverie. Anybody else? Well, thank you again for coming. There's food downstairs. I have a limited number of catalogs, but if you sign a list there, I'll try to get you one. And hopefully you'll see more of my work soon. I hope so.